In winters long enough to feel like a second landscape, frozen rivers turned into pale roads that no ruler had to decree and no mason had to raise. They appeared when the season allowed and vanished when the thaw returned, as if a city had lent its grand boulevard to the countryside for a few weeks only. People learned to treat these ice roads not as miracles but as routines, a way to reach market before the salt ran out, to bring fodder to animals on the far bank, to carry letters and news between villages, to guide herds across a boundary that in warmer months would have been loud water. The knowledge that made this possible was quiet, ordinary, and shared, the sort of knowledge that comes from watching a river every day of your life. It was passed along in small habits rather than in grand speeches. How to stand, where to listen, when to wait, and when to trust the surface just enough to step forward. Frozen rivers. Crossing without bridges is about those habits. It follows the long, sleepy tradition of common travelers and their careful ways, how they chose a line, carried a pole, tied a rope, felt for hollows, and interpreted the soft, cryptic sounds beneath the snow. There is no hero here, only winter itself and those who move gently through its instructions. No one lives on midriver. Every winter road begins and ends at a bank, and the bank decides more about the day than people admit. It is the first judge of attention and the last collector of relief, a slope where boots learn the mood of cold, a place where ropes become sentences, a shelf where sled runners taste the season before they are asked to ride on it. A bank that is tended behaves like a doorway. A bank ignored behaves like a step broken in the dark. The art of crossing, for all its talk of seams and thickness, is secretly about entrances and exits. Banks are not one thing. Some come down in a long, polite slide with sedge and willow stubs reading as punctuation under the snow. Others arrive as stubborn cuts where summer water worried the earth into a lip, then undercut it, then left it to freeze like a frown. There are banks with stones that keep their round shoulders under a thin quilt, banks that smell faintly of iron when you scrape them, banks that hold the memory of cartwheels even in January. Villagers keep a mental index, the gentle launch below the old poplar for morning errands, the stiffer ramp by the mill for days when a horse must work, the discreet landing behind reed and alder when a midwife is fetched at moonrise and the village prefers not to assemble an audience dot on the good banks. Someone has already practiced courtesy. Snow is stamped into shallow steps that the day refreezes into a tidy ladder. A windrow is shaped low on the riverside, not to block but to guide, so a boot finds the edge without guessing. Brush is laid where summer weeds grew, a thin mat that accepts a runner's nose without letting it pry down into sugary snow. If the slope is steep, a pair of short crossbars, little logs set perpendicular to the fall, give hooves and heels a pause to consider gravity without drama. None of it is grand. It is housekeeping under a sky that prefers austerity. Approach has its choreography. A party does not arrive bound in a bragging knot. It spreads, one person to find the steps with a pole and a little patience, one to mind the sled's hunger for downhill, one to keep the dog's excellent enthusiasm from turning into a lesson about momentum. Rope is given or gathered by a kind of breathing, paid out while gravity thinks, then shortened when the sled's nose has learned the slope. A bell that has served nobly on the river falls quiet near landings. Sound that helped attention out on the white can turn to fuss where other people's errands weave through the same doorway. Going down is an art of you and asking. The sled must be persuaded not to pass the person who leads it. A palm on the runner's shoulder, fingers curled just over the edge where wax remembers work, keeps the nose from inventing its own ideas. Some households carry a hand wisp of straw or a scrap of sacking for this exact moment, laid flat as a brief break where the slope's polish has grown too proud. Horses understand landings with barn sense. They've met ramps and planks before. The driver's voice grows lower by a shade, and the line is kept off to one side so the animal's body and the human's weight do not argue with the same square foot of ice in the first step. Coming up is another grammar entirely. Loads gather their own opinions about incline. Barrels want to roll, sacks want to lie down and nap. Wood wants to remember it is made of planks and try to slide back into being a fence. The diamond lash that behaved all morning is checked with a mitten knuckle. Pegs accept another half-hitch because banks are the hour for extra manners. A second rope is often invited to the conversation. A helper's line from the rear corner so a sled climbs as a square, not as a wedge. Children learn their best winter physics here. How a little pull from the back takes mischief from a load. How a pause 2 steps below the top wins more than a rush does. How knees bent like a promise make better ground than straight legs do on a slope. Good banks are also dispensers of truth. They tell more about the river than midstream can. At dawn the steps feel older, grainy, convincing, not brittle. By noon the top crust sulks, and the lower rises ring soft under the pole. Wind announces itself first at the edge where snow feathers into tiny banners and stings the cheek turned riverward. Thaw makes the bank smell different. Willow sweetens, mud suggests a memory. Travelers sweep a mitten across the first plate of ice below the steps, not because they doubt the whole river, but because the beginning is where the body decides its tempo. The pole is tapped, once on the gloss, once where the runner polish begins, once near a heeled seam that always sits like a stitch 3 paces out. Only then does the day really start. Landings multiply their duties on market days. They become coach rooms and hitching rails, bulletin boards and post offices. Sleds nose in, but always nose out, ready to remember the climb without confusion. Ropes are coiled like polite conversation and hung on pegs made from willow forks hammered into the bank. A boy tasked with watching a row of bells learns to win a kind of attention that has nothing to do with listening for music and everything to do with noticing the weight of a pause. A girl told to read the steps with a broom realizes the difference between dusting and grooming. One makes a show, the other makes a surface honest. In winter, honesty is traction. Not every bank allows improvement. Some are the river's corrections to human ambition. Steep cuts where ice forgets to hold itself near the rim. Crumbly sand that rejects steps and invites slides. Places where summer springs break their secret under the first plate. Villagers do not wage war on these banks. They name them and go elsewhere. Or they demote them to special hours landings. Only at dawn, only on glass mornings, only with hand sleds, only for letters. There is pride in knowing the shortcuts. There is wisdom in forgetting them for a season. Night raises the bank stakes. Lantern posts are moved closer and trimmed with stingier caps so their light falls on the steps rather than into the snowglow where it will flood a distance. Shadows perform their old honesty. Crisp margins mean texture a boot can trust. Ghosted edges mean an invitation to stay a pace nearer the windrow. Bells come alive again at the top, marking arrivals and departures in a register. The houses up the lane answer with their own tones. Latch clicks. A dog's reminder cough. A stove door giving a small iron shrug. Night is also the time when banks keep secrets. A letter slid to the ledge under the reed mat for a neighbor who prefers not to be the subject of a market's chorus. A rag tied high that tells the moonlit party which willow is the honest one when fog gathers low. Edges are the natural home of improvisation. A ladder with a rung gone is propped where a single bad step annoys 100 ankles. 2 reed mats laced together with wire become a small apron that tames the last glare of a thawing afternoon. A plank with iron nails bent over its ends is laid for hooves that would otherwise argue with the final 2 feet of slope. None of these things look handsome in summer. That is fine. Winter is not a season that awards prizes for appearance. It rewards arrangements that make politeness easy when breath is fogging and patience is already counting the steps to the stove. Ritual lives at banks, too, quiet and household-sized. A child is allowed to lead the sled up the last 3 rises once a week, to learn the weight and the angle and the way the rope speaks through a mitten. A newcomer is given the down slope once, with 2 hands near and a hand on the runner's shoulder that says without saying, "Let the sled follow your breath, not your legs." Old people take the middle steps and the first cup by the door when the climb is done. Such rituals taper pride into usefulness and turn neighbors into a crew. The bank is also where the river is thanked. There are no speeches. Wax is scraped from runners with the dull side of a knife and saved. Ropes are uncoiled so they won't teach themselves knots while they sleep. Poles are leaned where they can overhear the stove's first contented breath. A bell is tapped by a knuckle, one quiet syllable that, in a different season, would be called grace. If a day went badly and then better, the bank collects the difference and puts it away with the pegs and the broom in late winter, when the noon sun thickens and windows learn to drip again. Banks become the first honest critics of the season's vanity. Steps lose their crisp edges. Snow sits low and sullen. The first plate of ice under the windrow reflects like a lie. Villages reduce expectations by half without calling it surrender. Loads thin. Crossings move earlier. Landings earn extra brush and the most patient hands. The bank begins to say what the river will soon shout. Not now. The craft of crossing includes accepting this verdict at the doorway, without asking the floor to prove it after you've already stepped off the rug. Spring announces itself in sounds at the edge. The pole's ring fattens. A small burble where the landing kisses ice becomes a voice. The willow remembers colour in its bark. The first duck prints a dainty critique at the waterline and leaves. People stop tidying steps because the steps have quit participating. The river is allowed to repossess its threshold. A landing then looks peculiar. Brush stacked, pegs empty, the neat windrow softening into a memory. And just like that, the bank returns to being a bank, the way a stage returns to boards after the audience goes home. No less important for being empty. Waiting to be useful in a different script. The first rule of crossing a frozen river was not written anywhere, because it did not need to be. People simply knew it. You listen. Before a foot pressed into snow, before a sled's runner met a polished streak, before animals were coaxed from the bank, someone stood and listened. That meant not just opening the ears, but quieting everything else. The small talk, the impatience, the clever ideas about shortcuts. In the lull of morning, when the cold was still firm and unambitious, a person could hear what the ice wished to say. It spoke in little shifts and faraway thumps, in a lacework of ticks along its seams. The sound of a satisfied silence was different from the sound of a restless plate. Old travellers knew the difference without trying to name it. Listening was usually paired with tapping. A staff, usually of wood, sometimes ash or birch, was more than a walker's simple companion. Held loosely and let fall with a measured touch, the pole delivered a question and retrieved an answer. This was not a dramatic strike. It was a gentle attest, a courteous knock on a closed door. A dull thud hinted at wetness or rotten ice below. A clean, crisp note suggested denser structure. People who crossed often learned to compare these sounds with the day's temperature, the previous day's wind, and the thickness built up over the last cold spell. No one expected one signal to replace the others. It was the layered nature of the rules that mattered. Observation stitched to memory, touch stitched to temperature, and above all, patience stitched to everything else. The second rule was to read the river as a living shape, not as a plain sheet. Even frozen, a river does not stop being a river. It remembers its own curves and keeps them. The places where current had once pressed harder would often hold thinner ice. Places where eddies liked to linger could hide soft pockets under a seaming crust. Old paths traced arcs rather than straight lines, honouring the river's habit of favouring one bank and disfavouring another. It isn't that people could see the current. Often they couldn't. They walked by analogies. This bend always hummed in early winter. That island gathered driftwood and kept a protective apron of ice around it. That ford downstream caused snow to sit differently on the surface. 1,000 small observations, memorized by feet. Third came weight and spacing. A single person could move with a certain freedom, but once a load joined the traveller, sacks of grain, timber lengths, baskets of dried fish, the pace changed. Sleds were kept light or drawn in pairs, not heaped too high. People seldom bunched together. They drifted along in a loose thread where each person's pause was another person's notice. This was not ceremony but prudence. Even the sound of travel mattered. The creak of leather, the softness of runners, the hush of felted boots. A noisy crossing was often a careless one, and no one prided themselves on getting across loudly. The fourth rule was humility about the day's character. Mornings after a clear, sharp night were trusted more than afternoons after a weak, damp cold. Snow could be friend or foe. A clean dusting sometimes insulated and preserved strength, while a heavy fall could insulate rot and fool the eye. A traveller might kneel and sweep a mittened hand to see the surface, glassy or granular, cracked or sound. If a crack was found, it was greeted without alarm. Most were old, healed seams that had spoken already. Some were fresh and still murmuring. People learned to walk parallel to these lines rather than across them abruptly, letting their path be redrawn by the river's faint geometry. Fifth, there was the rope. Not a dramatic coil, not a rescue showpiece, but a plain rope that belonged to everyone. It connected person to sled, sled to person, sometimes person to person in a loose spacing that preserved individuality. If a place felt uncertain, the rope would be made a little longer. If the surface felt wholesome, it would be shortened so the sled followed obediently along. In some regions, a small bell on the sled served as a companionable metronome, its regular note telling more about steadiness than about danger. A heartbeat for the crossing rhythm. Sixth, there was the habit of learning from animals without indulging in the myth of their infallibility. Dogs that had run many winters learned to avoid the gnashing mouths of tributaries. Horses with snow season experience could sense hollows the way they sensed weak boards in a barn floor. Yet no one surrendered judgment to the paws or hooves entirely. Animals were watched and thanked, not obeyed blindly. A dog that balked was not urged forward. A horse that hesitated might be circled back to firmer ground. People used their staffs again, and the rope again, and the listening again. Predicted patience was the seventh rule. Repeat the earlier rules rather than invent new ones. Eighth, voices stayed low. Not out of fear that loud sound would shatter the river, but because a quiet crossing allowed each traveler to keep a share of the common attention. Someone at the front might call out a small notice: shallow snow here, old seam left, hollow sound, and the message would pass back. Not like an urgent alarm, but like instructions in a shared craft. There were no heroes in this craft, only reliable companions. Even children were included when the time was right. They were given the smaller tasks first, sweeping snow from a mark, holding the rope while an elder stooped to listen, so that the rules became part of their ordinary winter vocabulary. Ninth, people accepted the river's calendar. Some crossings were appointed by the season: a weekly path to the market across midstream, a midwinter path to the mill when roads were drifted under, a late-season path to the far hayfield to pull back the last stacks before the thaw's brittle afternoons made the surface treacherous. The river shaped desire into routine. If someone said, "We could cut a day by going early," an elder might answer, "We will save the day by going late." Time kept with the river was a different arithmetic, one in which safety counted as speed. Lastly, the crossing was remembered, not just for triumph or for hazard, but for instruction. People spoke of it at home not as adventure but as household maintenance, like sweeping the hearth or mending the fence. The ice was clean today. It was speaking on the right bank. The upstream bend still carries a hollow. These are not dramatic lines, but they made the next day possible. In this way, listening to the ice was not a momentary act but a season-long conversation, unhurried and circular. The rules had no author because everyone authored them, adding a thread here and not there, until the rope of practice held steady from generation to generation. And so, before tools and cleverness, before maps and measures, there was this: a person on a bank, a careful breath, a staff laid down upon the snow, a rope that understood its business, and a river that agreed. For a short while, to become a quiet road. If the first practice was listening, the second was choosing. A river covered in snow can look like a single blank page, but anyone who has ever written on winter knows that the page is already full of text. The crossing line is not imposed upon that page. It is discovered in it, a thread of ordinary sense that gathers many quiet signs and ties them together. The decision seldom arrives all at once. It is built out of a dozen small recognitions, each too plain to matter alone and yet decisive in company. Travelers began with the banks, because the banks remembered stories the ice had only just begun to tell. A clean, gradual slope with sedge or willow nubs peeking through the snow meant the river had lapped gently there in warm months. The ice near such a bank often formed early and with fewer hidden pockets. A steep, undercut edge, by contrast, hinted at stubborn current and sometimes at springs that bled warmth into the channel even in the bitterest spells. The footprints of animals played the role of marginal notes in the text, fox tracks that ventured a little way and then turned back, the long, splay-toed imprint of a hare that chose the cattail shallows rather than the center, the neat, repeated trail of a village dog that had already learned which stretch gave nothing more than a soft groan when crossed at dawn. None of these marks provided certainty, but together they argued for or against a direction. Snow itself laid down a thin commentary. Fine, wind-laid snow that arranged itself in feathered ripples told of open, sweeping air above a broader, less complicated sheet. Heavy, pitted snow that had slumped and then crusted suggested melted patches and refrozen hollows underneath. River ice is not only thick or thin, it is also honest or deceptive. Honest ice shows its worries in crease lines and blunt seams. Deceptive ice dresses them in a perfect white. The practiced eye treated perfection with suspicion. Accordingly, the line across the river tended to wander in small, respectful curves, giving old seams a wide berth and pausing wherever the snow thickened inexplicably, as if it had fallen into a shallow bowl. The river's bends mattered because even on the coldest day, the river never fully forgot to move. The outside of a bend had once been a place of scouring current. The inside had once collected silt and drift. Ice inherits that memory. Travelers mark the inside arc with their poles, stepping along it like a well-mannered guest who stays near the wall and avoids the center of the room. If the river split around a small gravel island, the chosen line often slipped between island and near bank, where current slowed and the ice stacked itself like layered glass. Where the channel narrowed into a throat, people often retreated to the wider reach upstream, favoring room over boldness. The line was not the shortest path. It was the friendliest. When the eye alone could not settle the question, the pole was made to help. Not with a spear's lunge, but with repeated, conversational taps. One step, one tap. One step, one tap. The sound was compared against what the cold had done overnight. If the previous evening had brought sudden wind from a warmer quarter, and the morning felt kinder than it should, the same note that sounded safe 2 days earlier might now be treated with doubt. Some carried an auger in a canvas wrap, no bigger than a man's forearm, and made a small, neat hole where they hesitated. The water that rose into that hole said as much as the ice did. Lively water, quick to creep up and slosh, suggested an untrustworthy undercurrent. Reluctant water, slow to admit itself, spoke of stillness below and strength in the sheet. Someone would measure with a thin branch or a simple mark stick. But even measurement did not command belief. It joined the chorus of other signs and sang no louder than they did. Light became an ally. On overcast days, the river lay in one soft value, a grey that hid its moods and made even careful people feel slightly careless. Sunlight, especially low winter light, restored texture. Frost bloom glittered a little over thicker pieces. Darker, sullen patches deferred light and asked for patience. Travelers learned to swing their gaze sideways, not straight down, because a bleak light told more truth. They noticed how shadows of willow wands fell across the ice. On sound surfaces, the shadows behaved like crisp ink lines. On suspect patches, they fuzzed and broke, as if the surface were unsure how to receive them. In late afternoon, when the day loosened its grip, everything softened. The light, the ice, the decisions. In that hour, the line often retreated toward the bank and accepted a longer walk rather than a risky straightening. Sometimes the best line was made possible by work that took place days earlier. People shoveled old snow into low windrows to mark last week's safe way, or set short willow switches that protruded from the drift like the stitch marks on a hem. The markers were modest and mortal. Wind and new snow erased them easily. But while they lasted, they lent the eye a memory. Here, before, we passed. Sled runners etched habits into the surface. A week of crossings polished a narrow track, not merely smooth but slightly hollowed by repetition. Even when it snowed, the hollow remembered. You could feel it through boots, a tiny dip that comforted the ankle and said, "Others have gone here." Occasionally the line asked for a pause that felt, to an impatient traveler, like inconvenience and, to a seasoned one, like courtesy. A stretch with mid-channel murmurs was allowed to finish its thought. An hour or two of colder breeze invited to sit down properly. People were not ashamed to wait on the bank and share a little bread, to work the stiffness out of mittens, to undo and redo the rope around the sled while the day recovered its hard edge. In that waiting lay wisdom. Rivers did not respect deadlines, and ice did not care for a person's hurry. There was no romance in plunging through when an hour's patience would have made strength. Animals helped choose the line, but only in conversation with the people who guided them. A dog trotted ahead and danced away from a whispering seam. The handler did not automatically follow, but he did note the dog's choice and tap there himself. A small bell on the lead sled kept time as much as it gave warning. Its tone changed over roughness, and the ear that had been listening from the bank continued to listen on the move. Horses placed their hooves with a barn sense, careful on strange flaws, and if they disapproved, their flanks told the story long before their feet did. A quiet, stiffening breath was sometimes worth more than a shouted caution. Crossing with children meant drawing the line twice, once on the river and once in a lesson. Elders named the reasons for a curve or a detour without turning the naming into a test. We keep to the inside bend here. We skirt that darker plate until the willow. We step between the two seams, not across them. The child felt not only where to go, but why a person might choose such a path. In this way, the line became communal property. Held in shared language as much as in footfalls did I end certain places the river forced a choice between two imperfect lines, one shorter but crossed with thin, singing plates, the other longer but sure-footed and a little dull. The old rule favoured dull. The brave line, taken once, had to be remembered every time. It taught the wrong lesson, that risk could be made routine. The dull line confirmed the right habit, that an ordinary, reliable distance is a friend to all. And because winter is long and human attention is not, the habit mattered more than the day's timekeeping. Over the season, the chosen line drifted, just as people did. A warm spell pushed it toward the bank. A week of cruel, bright cold lured it back toward midstream. Someone who had not crossed for 10 days would be forgiven for feeling lost on a familiar river. But the skills themselves did not drift. They waited where the bank met the ice, ready to be gathered again. Read the bank. Attend to the snow. Bend with the bend. Trust the slow light. Sound the surface. Measure if you must. Honor the old marks. Wait when waiting is a form of moving. Let animals advise without commanding. Make the dull choice and be content. The line, in other words, was not a mark on the river. It was a way of behaving did I end the evening. When the thing was done and the far bank received the travellers as if they had never been away, no one praised the line. They talked instead about chores, fodder to be carried, oats to be traded, a letter to be delivered. Yet the line had carried all of that. It had been built from the same quiet that winter asked of everything. Slow breath, low voice, careful feet. The river, having tolerated the procession for one more day, resumed being a river. The ice, that borrowed bridge, resumed its private conversation with the sky. Tomorrow would ask again, and tomorrow the line would be found again, not as a performance but as a simple answer to a simple question. Where, today, does the river agree to be a road? If listening taught humility and measuring taught patience, the craft of carrying taught proportion. Frozen rivers were crossed for reasons that filled cellars and fed mouths. Sacks of rye and barley when the road overland lay drifted and mean. Split billets of birch and alder for stoves that chewed steadily through the long dark. Bundles of flax, coils of rope, jars of rendered fat stopped with cloth. A brace of planks for a porch repair promised before the thaw. The river became useful not only because it stiffened into a road, but because people learned how to ask it to carry their burdens politely. That politeness had a shape sleds, more than carts, understood the season's grammar. A sled's runners, thin, curved at the nose like a sentence that knew how to begin, distributed weight in a long, forgiving line. Where a cart would hammer its wheel ruts into a protest, runners whispered across the surface, ironing little tensions instead of jabbing them. Families kept several sizes, a narrow, nimble hand sled that a child could manage with firewood or with the morning's milk pail wrapped in wool. A broader freight sled for 2 adults and a horse, its bed lashed with crosspieces so that ropes bit into something and loads could be cinched without shifting. The best runners had learned the river across several winters. darkened with linseed and waxed with tallow or even a candle stub. Before a crossing, someone always laid a palm along the underside, gauging the slickness the way a baker touches a loaf and judges doneness. The ritual was not vanity. It was the beginning of courtesy. Loads were secured with a geometry that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with quiet. A diamond lash over a water skin kept its roundness from becoming a nuisance. A square lash across stacked sacks pressed their bellies into one body. Rope rings slipped over the necks of clay jars and then tied down to pegs so the jars could murmur to themselves but not argue with the sled. Little wedge sticks, no larger than a hand, were tapped beneath a plank bundle so that the bundle made its own decision to stay still. A good load did not look magnificent. It looked inevitable, as if it had grown there in the night. The order on the sled mattered as much as the knots. Dense things sat lowest and nearest the sled center, encouraging the runners to kiss the surface evenly. Lighter things, always prepared to be tricksters, were made to behave by being pressed gently between heavier neighbors. Fragile items learned humility beneath blankets or in wooden boxes whose lids had known winter before. A traveler looked at the sled from the side and asked a simple question: "Does this shape want a tip?" If the answer was even a whisper of yes, the lashings were reconsidered. Nothing was left to the river's mercy that could be managed by the hand. Spacing between travelers became a matter of weight as much as of caution. A single person and a hand sled could skim along in a loose solitude, pausing when the surface invited reflection. Two larger sleds, drawn by a horse or by the patience of two people, arranged themselves so that their pressures did not stack. The rope between the first sled and the second was paid out a little longer on questionable stretches, shortened to conversation length on trusted lanes. If someone at the front crossed a seam at a slight angle, the one behind did not copy blindly but chose a neighboring shallow angle, so that the same square foot of ice was not made to answer twice in one breath. The choreography wasn't crisp like formation marching. It was soft-footed and adaptive. A flocking of neighbors' horses, when used, were harnessed to winter with quiet respect. No one asked a spirited animal for theatrical displays. Steady horses were winter's favorites. Their hoofs sometimes wore temporary cleats, small, practical teeth that bit just enough to prevent foolish slips. The driver walked with a line, not behind the horse's rump where the sled might nudge him if the animal paused. On uncertain intervals, the driver shifted off to one side, paying out the rope so that horse and human did not move as one weight. A driver's voice, low and familiar, worked like a second harness, a drift of tone that kept the animal's thoughts calm. A startled horse is a multiplication of weight. A soothed one is its own ballast. Children learn the math of loads by feel rather than by tables. Two sacks up front balance the plank, an aunt would say, and then show how pressing gently on the sled's nose changed its appetite for the ice. A boy would tuck the extra rope under the lash so it didn't snag. A girl would slide a palm along the runner to learn whether yesterday's wax still held. Small bodies with big mittens handled big ideas: center of gravity, distribution, drag. The river taught physics without chalk, and the lesson stayed in the wrists. Some communities kept loaner sleds the way towns keep brooms, plain. Sturdy things left beside a shed at the river lane, with a tiny carved mark to show ownership. The idea was that anyone might need to move a bundle in the hour when the ice was most agreeable. The rules for borrowing were the rules for living. Return it before dark, mend a frayed rope, leave the runners a little better than you found them. Winter made misers of luxuries but spenders of attention. The shared sleds were proof that attention could be gifted. Friction played the role of both friend and adversary. On a brittle cold morning, runners flew so easily over the glass that a person might forget themselves and move too quickly. On a damp, moody afternoon, the same load felt heavy as a grudge. Travelers adjusted without complaint. They set one more hand to the rope on soft days, or cut a detour to keep to a known strong path when the sled began to sulk. If a hill presented itself at the bank, a modest incline that would let the sled slide down to the river, they lay straw or brush to keep the descent from becoming a comedy. Tools were pressed into double duty. The measuring stick became a lever to nudge the sled's tail back into line. The tapping pole turned shepherd, guiding the nose around a peevish seam. There were limits built into the geometry. No one pretended that the river owed them a crossing just because the sled was cleverly packed. Springs that bled warmth under the ice near certain banks made lyres of the most beautiful lashings. The outflow from a mill race, the mouth of a tributary, the place where the current pressed impatiently around a stone, these geographies trumped neat knots and clean runners. The wise response was not bravery but rearrangement. Unload half, ferry it to the safer bend, return for the rest. The river respected this humility. It is strange to say that a landscape can be flattered by a person's prudence, and yet prudence was the only flattery Winter believed. Stories about loads tended to be domestic, not dramatic. An old man would recall the year the salt barrels came late and heavy, and how they packed straw under the staves so the straps didn't bite. An old woman would laugh about the goose that insisted on riding the sled like a magistrate, honking with every heeled crack. Those stories contained the arithmetic of the season. The measurements were not merely inches of ice, but ounces of behavior, how slowly a hill was taken, how evenly a rope was hauled, how softly a horse was spoken to when its breath smoked in a blue AI day T-day's end. The geometry came home. The sled was unlashed and inside things resumed their domestic names: mug, spoon, firewood, turnip, letter. The rope dried on a peg by the stove, not as a monument to work but as a quiet line waiting to be a line again. The runners were scraped with a dull blade to lift whatever grit had stowed away in their wax. A rag borrowed a dab of tallow and gave back a small, clean shine. While hands worked, someone would say, "Tomorrow we'll take the path by the willow." The inside bend felt honest. No one needed to add, "And we will load in the same low manner, and walk in the same even temper, and cross as if the river were doing us a favor," because it was. The frozen river kept its own calendar. Villages had almanacs pinned to kitchen walls, with saints' days and moon phases and a neat column for debts paid. But winter's truest schedule lived outside, in the way the cold tightened and slackened across a single day. People learned the river's hours as one learns the temperament of a relative, which mornings could be asked for favors, which afternoons preferred to be left alone, and how a week of quiet skies conversed differently with the ice than a week of roaming wind. The craft of timing was not superstition. It was daily physics made ordinary: air that hardens water, water that answers back, snow that interferes like an argumentative cousin. Dawn was the hour of permission. Night gathered strength for the river like a blanket pressed under weight, tightening what the previous day had let relax. Before sunrise, the ice sounded dry and decisive under a traveller's pole. Even the breath fog felt disciplined, rising in tidy plumes that did not sprawl. Boots met a surface with manners. In those hours, a person could sometimes persuade a reluctant seam to behave, simply because the cold had whispered the seam to sleep. It was not bravery to prefer dawn. It was thrift. The same load that would ask two people's pull at noon might agree to follow on a single rope at first light. Mid-morning brought a softening that was not betrayal so much as honesty. The sun, low and pale, found purchase in the river's bubble-top layer and began to untie the night's small knots. Travellers watched for subtle changes, the way a chisel's ping mellowed by a shade, the polite stiffening of a horse's ears, a dog's paws becoming more careful in their music. None of these meant retreat, only adjustment. Sled ropes were paid out a touch longer, spacing widened, the line shaded toward shore. Winter did not ask heroics of those who read its clock. It asked for the kind of patience that looks like laziness to people who do not live with rivers. By noon, even on days a person would call cold, the ice grew talkative. It seems remembered that underneath them ran water with opinions. These opinions rose as tiny pressures, nothing dramatic, only a little more insistence around bent shoulders, a little more readiness to argue near a spring-fed bank. Travellers did fewer things at noon. A routine that began with 3 crossings before dinner might fold itself into 2, one in the hush of early light, one at the day's youngest warmth before the light grew indulgent. Afternoons were for chores that travelled on wooden floors. Grain could be ground, harness mended, a letter composed. The river rested. There were exceptions the ice itself announced. A bitter, crystalline day when breath crackled at the nostrils and the sky seemed made of salt might hold itself firm from dawn until dusk. In such weather, even noon could be trusted, though trusted never meant ignored. People remembered that no season is a single thing. Even a cruelly cold day could hide a lively undercurrent around an outflow or a deceitful softness under drifted snow where a week's wind had insulated rot. The clock of cold did not erase the map of the river. It only backlit it. Wind ran its own schedule over the hours. A still night that gave a hard morning might be followed by a day when wind pressed water under the ice, not enough to lift but enough to make the sheet frown. In those hours, a traveller heard tiny, distant thumps travel farther, as if the river were relaying news along its spine. Not warnings, exactly, more like a reminder that an inland sea still pulsed underfoot. When wind had herded snow into long, combed ridges, the clock shifted further. There was spindrift to blind the eye and sound to confuse the ear. People chose the lee of willow clumps for their approach and let the wind dictate pauses, as one lets a talkative neighbour finish before adding anything useful. The season's larger calendar felt almost domestic. Early winter brought the first tentative crossings, shy errands to the mill, a child's sledge drawn along the inner bend to visit a cousin, a pair of baskets taken over at dawn for trade. Then came the confidence of midwinter, dependable mornings, dependable mid-morning corrections, a rhythm of loads and return loads that let people plan. Late winter invited vanity and punished it. The surface could present a false, black brilliance at breakfast, sun on glass, perfect and proud, and by mid-afternoon turned to fatigue. The bubbles in the white layer elongating into what elders called candles, thin vertical panes that would hold a glove but not a life. The word candled did not frighten children because the adults did not turn it into theatre. It simply meant not now. Snow taught timing as much as cold did. A fresh powder fall over a night of true freeze was like a cloth laid over a polished table, gentle to runners and kind to boots, easily brushed aside to listen. A heavy, wet fall atop sullen ice made a lyre of the surface. It insulated warmth from below, turning the day's clock against the traveller. One learned to read posture, how the snow sat in its own weight, how it sagged very slightly between healed cracks, how a sled's runner left a lazy furrow or cut a clean whispering groove. When the snow invited, the morning extended. When it sulked, the morning narrowed to a single useful hour, and no more. Household time tied itself to river time, as ropes to sleds. Bakers put bread to rise before dawn so a crossing could carry loaves while they were still whispering heat through their crusts. Smiths watched the colour of the forge against the sun, arranging repairs around an early errand to fetch a length of timber. Schoolchildren carried slates across for a lesson and learned that numbers made more sense when the world outside also kept count. The bell that called to prayer or meeting did not scold those who came late on softened days. A village was kinder when the river asked it to be. Travellers, being human, argued with the clock now and then. Someone said, "If we hurry, we might fit in a second load before dinner." Someone older said, "If we wait, we will surely fit one after." Over the years, the older voice was proved right often enough that the younger voice learned to imitate it. That imitation was not obedience so much as imitation of a style, the style of restraint, the rhetoric of ordinary safety. Attention is a kind of fuel, and winter work spends it quickly. Best to budget it in the hours when the river agrees to your terms. Markets across the river made their own kind of punctuality. The winter fair in the next town, set near a broad reach where the ice grew like clear glass, sharpened the skill of choosing hours. People arrive like a migrating pattern in the first light. Sled bells few at first, then more, then a braided jingle that somehow stayed modest. By midday, business moved indoors while the river was left to its creeks. In late afternoon, when the sun slanted low and the air glittered without warmth, the procession reversed, lighter loads coming home as coins turned into provisions. The river did not host fools. A cart left too late always became a story, and the story always featured neighbours hauling most of her home in the dark after the cold returned. Animals had clocks without watches. A dog woke from the hearth with the first stirring and stood at the door because it felt that morning hardness needed to be used, not admired. Horses took their cues from leather and tone. A halter lifted at dawn meant a respectful walk, not a test. Cattle driven across to winter pasture on the far bank moved best when their breath smoked in a straight line and their hooves clicked like teacups on a tray. If the hour was wrong, their tails told the truth, the little sideways swish that said, "The floor is not what you say it is." People did not argue with tails. They rearranged their plans. The moon's calendar threaded through this clockwork. Full moon nights after a bright, still day could become a kind of second dawn. The world glowed with a patient silver that made the river's honest places shine like pewter and its troubled ones brood like slate. Some communities used those nights for the quietest crossings. Letters carried to a far cousin, a midwife fetched without fuss, a simple, necessary crossing not recorded in any ledger. But even then the rules remained the same. Low voices, tested edges, the rope made a little longer just in case. Romance belonged to songs. Winter preferred habits. All of this knowledge passed in phrases that were not instructions so much as reminders. Take it before the sun gets ideas. Leave it until the frost finishes its thought. If the wind talks in the poplars, do your visiting on this side. A child heard these sayings and filed them next to recipes. Next to the way boots were dried upside down so their legs wouldn't slump. Next to the custom of cutting kindling on the bank while waiting for the morning to firm. Nothing in it felt like training. It was life, when spring finally announced itself in ways no one could deny, the noon shadows shortening, the roofs dripping with a steady patience. The river's undervoice beginning to sound like laughter from a closed room. Timing moved from when to cross to when to stop crossing. This ending was staged, not sudden. People reduced their loads, thickened their spacing, and then yielded altogether, with a hearty practicality that did not mourn the convenience because it had never counted on it. The river, thanked without ceremony, resumed being a line between shores instead of a road. Those who had kept its hours all winter returned to wooden bridges or to long walks around bends, content in the knowledge that the ice would write new hours next year, and they would read them then. A frozen river does not go silent when it hardens. It changes languages. Where summer speech is liquid, bulbed, and hurrying, winter's is etched and whispered. Lines appear, some straight with a confidence that looks almost arrogant, some faint as a pencil's last breath, some braided like old rope. Travelers learn to treat these marks as sentences written for them, advice from the water to the feet, suggestions to the sled, reminders that this wide, pale corridor is still a river having a conversation with itself beneath the lid. The simplest lines are the long, clean cracks that run across a broad reach after a night of hard, shrinking cold. They are not all betrayals. Often they are the river's way of sighing as it tightens, opening a seam not from weakness but from order, the way a wooden table holds a gap so it won't swell and warp. People called them working cracks, and they listened to them the same way they listened to the wind in the poplars, a part of the day's truth. A traveller's pole would tap near such a seam, then alongside it, and then a little farther off. The answers came in tones, hollow here, satisfied there, and the path slipped parallel to the line with a decent margin. Like a polite walker keeping to the inside of a hallway so that another may pass, more worrying with the fresh. Wet seams that looked like drawn ink just beginning to dry. These showed themselves when the river had lifted and settled within a few hours, under wind's persuasion or after a night when temperature zigzagged. The eye learned to notice the gloss of a new crack compared with the chalk of an old one. New ones held a cold sheen and sometimes the ghost of a dark undersurface. Old ones wore frosted rims and a powder fringe from many days' breath and 100 small scuffs. No one dramatized the difference. One simply gave the new line more space, crossed it at a shallow angle if crossing was necessary at all, and let the rope pay out so that if the sled disapproved it could say so, without dragging a person's ankles into the argument. There were seams that healed themselves, like careful stitches, short striations that crossed, a path like notes in a margin. After a small thaw and a quick return to freeze, snow would fall, melt into slush where the line had opened, and then set. The result was milky, useful ice with a memory, stronger than it looked but still a reminder. Children learn to sweep such places with mittened hands and feel the slight change in texture, the way the skin recognizes a scar under its own warmth. Elders told the children, A healed line is not a lie, but it asks for courtesy. The child would nod solemnly, domesticating caution into a household habit like banking the stove at night. The T bends, pressure ridges ran like soft, rumpled spines, ice shingled over ice where the moving water below nudged the plates together and forced them to ride up. These were beautiful in their way, whitened by pulverized frost and tufted with trapped snow crystals that sparkled in the low sun. Beauty did not make them friendly. Sleds did not like their ribs. Horses disliked the clatter under hoof. So a route would drift towards the inside arc where the river rested. Let the pressure ridge have its proud line, and pass by with a neighbor's courtesy, eyes turned, steps quiet, as if respecting an older person's nap.in. Certain reaches where springs bled warmth or where a tributary joined, the ice learned a darker script. Black ice could be honest, a plate so clear and thick it looked like a window into night, but it could also be a mask for impatience. People read context. Black within a field of white often signaled thinness. Black that ran as a long sheet where the river widened and the wind kept snow away might be sound, especially if marked by the clean, crystalline fracture lines of deep, fast freezes. A test hole here mattered more than eloquence. The marked stick spoke the plain word the eye could not. Enough, or not today. In late winter, the white layer above sometimes candled, its bubbles stretching into vertical panes that looked firm until a boot showed the fiction. Those panes rang a little under the pole, a tiny glissando instead of a note. That music was not to be trusted. Sometimes the river broke grammar altogether and made a lead, an open lane where current or wind had torn back the crust. In broad country, people learned to bridge small leads with spruce boughs laid like green quilts, the needles biting into the edge and offering the sled a modest promise. The bough bridge was never poetry for its own sake. It was a utilitarian stanza. Cross here, slowly, with rope slack and with the dog kept close. If the lead argued, the party simply stepped away and tried a different verb. The river did not reward insistence. Snow wrote glosses over the lines. Feathered ripples formed by steady wind spoke of broad, steady ice beneath. Pockmarked crust after a flurry and a thaw might hide slush pockets around seams. Travellers watched how their own shadows fell across these surfaces. On strong places, edges were crisp even in pale light. On dubious patches, shadows lost their certainty and fuzzed, as if refusing to commit. The pole, rung on the rim of a test hole, converted such visual grammar into sound. It was not a code to memorize so much as a dialect to absorb. This is how the river speaks when it is happy. This is how it mutters when it wants to be left alone. The language extended to noise that travelled, booms and thumps that ran like messenger birds along the spine of the ice. A deep, distant report on a bitter morning could be the river stretching its plates, carving a new seam far away. Old travellers did not shudder when they heard these shots. They paused, counted a slow handful of breaths, and let the energy spend itself. Once the sound had flown on, the surface underfoot was often steadier for it. It has said its piece. Someone would murmur, and the party would continue. The way one resumes a conversation after a door has slammed in a different room. Households kept words for particular lines the way they kept names for hills and barns. The comb line near the mill where wind combed snow into raised ribs. The knife seam under the poplar where a fissure always stayed oddly sharp and straight. The mother stitch midstream where freezes and thaws had embroidered white over black until the surface looked quilted. These names were not quaintness for visitors. They were coordinates in a lived map. A child hearing them for the 10th winter would one day say them to a child of their own without thinking. And the river would be legible again when a path had to cross a family of seams, parallel lines marching across the width like staff paper. Travellers let their own bodies become notation. They crossed at a shallow slant, not square, so that each foot and each runner touched, then left, then touched the next while the other still held sound ground. The rope took part in the dance, loose enough to accept a small hesitation without yanking, tidy enough that no coil dropped to snag on a ridge and invent a problem. If a sled's jar made the jar's murmur, a hand pressed the lashings until the chorus quieted. There were domestic rituals for difficult days. A bag of straw rode along for short spreads over wet seams, a sprinkle to keep a boot from caughting a slick edge, a scatter to give a horse the modest fiction of a floor. Brush carried from the bank became temporary footing where the river insisted on gloss. None of this was dramatic. It was the same spirit that lays a rag under a leaking kettle, practical mercy for a surface trying its best to tee home. People spoke of the day's lines while they mended mittens or turned a heel on a sock. The pressure spine near the willow is growing. Proud. The healed stitch beyond the island is strong if you ask it nicely. The black plate upstream is honest until noon. These sentences sounded like gossip, but they were a village's shared grammar lesson. There were no exams, just a daily reading. Look, listen, name, remember, and give way when the text grows difficult. What the river asked in return for such literacy was small, that feet be humble, that loads be orderly, that voices be low, that impatience be saved for summer complaints. In exchange, it offered the oldest kind of crossing, a granted favour, not an entitlement. The lines, the seams, the ridges, the gloss, all of them were handwriting across a pale page that would be erased come spring. For a season, though, they could be read, and reading them made the difference between a hurried story that ends with a cold surprise and a quiet story that ends at a warm door. Grand equipment never made much sense on a frozen river. The ice respected modest tools, the sorts of things that hid easily by the hearth and could be readied in the time it took water to boil. The crossing's grammar relied on little nouns, a pole that asked questions, a rope that arranged relationships, a bell that kept time, a knife that freed a snag, a bundle of spruce needles that invented a floor where none existed, a handful of willow switches that stitched memory into the snow. These were not talismans. They were courtesies, each one a way of saying to the river, "We will tread as guests." The pole came first, because listening came first. Most families had two, a light tapping staff and a heavier, iron-tipped bar. The tapping staff was ash or birch, honest woods that held a straight grain and a temperate spring. Its length made a friendly triangle with the traveller's stride, long enough that the pole could reach ahead by a pace and reply before the boot committed itself, short enough that the hand did not tire of carrying it all morning. The iron-tipped bar, sometimes nothing more than a length of old wagon tire forged to a point, was winter's punctuation mark, a way to put a period on doubt, then a neat ring of shavings around the answer. Neither tool was theatrical. The staff's tap was the river's riddle delivered back to itself. The bar's nibble, a respectful footnote, poles aged into local instruments. A straight stick that had learned one river proved clumsy on another. It was not the wood but the hand that knew the dialect. People wore them smooth where their gloves nested, wrapped them with a whip of leather where the palm preferred to catch, tied a loop at the butt so a mitten could keep ownership without grip when hands were busy with rope. A few practical folk cut shallow notches at measured fingers along the shaft, poor man's marks that, in a pinch, told as much as a ruler. When a pole cracked, as all things do when winters outnumber them, its broken length became a child's staff and its story began again at a shorter reach. Ropes were quieter than poles. They did their work by arranging the world. Family ropes were plain, hemp or flax twist, sometimes rawhide thongs cut narrow and true. The rope's genius lay in keeping things separate just enough. Sleds separate from person, persons separate from person, the dog's curiosity separate from the dangerous edge of fresh gloss. A long rope on a doubtful straight let the sled confess disagreement without recruiting ankles. A short rope on a proven curve turned load and traveller into one calm creature, like a person carrying a basket on a hip. Ropes also carried memory. Knots stayed where last winter's fingers had found them, and hands trusted those places the way one trusts a railing on a steep stair. Rope work belonged to the winter household. Children practiced the square lash that kept sacks tame, the clove hitch that perched on a peg and refused to budge, the half hitches that turned extra tail into obedience. Women had their preferred coils and men theirs. The river noticed neither distinction and accepted any knot tied cleanly. A traveller cutting a complicated crossing into simple steps would sometimes gather the rope into 3 little loops in the hand like promises. This loop for the lead across the healed seam. This loop to lengthen along the doubtful hollow. This loop to shorten when the willow markers resume. The loops felt like decisions already half decided. Then there were the bells. A bell on a sled did not worship drama any more than the rope did. It kept a rhythm. The old folks favored little throats of bronze that carried a hunted note, just enough sound to mark steadiness, not enough to abuse attention. On close, foggy days the bell was a metronome for a moving sentence. Its measure thinned a little over roughness, fell into a hush over gloss, regained confidence when the runners kissed the river's honest skin again. Horses wore bells sometimes, but not as parade. A single small bell on the breast strap spoke to a driver who kept his eyes on the ice and his hands free. It was the rope in musical form knives served in practical, unheroic ways. Sheath knives lay along belts where mittens could reach without fumbling. A short, stout blade lived on the sled near the lashings. They freed a line that hooked a pressure rib, trimmed a switch to mark yesterday's safe line, pared a wedge to chock the plank bundle, shaved a breath of wax to sweeten the runners. The same knife that buttered bread at noon cut spruce boughs into a modest bridge over a narrow wet seam. A good blade carried the river's ethics. Do the smallest thing that solves the problem. Leave the surface better than you found it. Keep sharpness for need. Not for show, augers and chisels made their own brief appearances. Wrapped in canvas so they would not bite what they shouldn't. An auger smaller than a man's forearm could write little circles in the ice all morning without announcing itself. The chisel spoke a shorter, firmer sentence. Families that could not spare iron adapted. A sharply whittled tamarack steak would test a doubt. A pronged goose quill bound to the end of a stick would plumb the depth of slush beneath a crust. A bundle of twigs tied as a broom would sweep truth out of a shallow snow. In winter, tools were verbs, not nouns, borrowing whatever grammar the day required, clothing counted as part of the kit. Felted boots, not proud but practical, spread weight and muffled mistakes. A mitten with a leather palm let rope slide in disciplined degrees. A scarf tied low quieted breath into the collar so frost would not grow a mask and blind peripheral vision. People wore their coats a notch looser than fashion required. Room for slow work, room for the body's small negotiations with cold. On the loud days of wind, goggles improvised from slitted bark or from a child's slate with narrow windows cut in it kept fine spindrift from turning the world into confusion. The river, decorous as it was, could be petty about blown snow. Signals lived in pockets as much as tools did. A bundle of willow switches, trimmed and notched, turned a day's crossing into a map for tomorrow's. A strip of cloth torn and tied high on a bank twig said, "This is where the inside bend felt honest." A loop stomped into snow with a boot heel marked a test hole repaired and safe to ignore. A child standing beside an elder learned to stand the switch at a tilt that meant curve and straight for go on, as if learning a small alphabet written at ankle height. The smallest kit was breath and voice. Travelers kept their speaking tools tuned low. A shouted warning panicked animals and spent attention. A hand raised or a word carried on its own quiet carefulness did better. Seam left. Hollow tone. Lengthen rope. Shorten. We'll wait. The words had no exclamation points. They were as plain as the pole, as unpretentious as the knife, as trustworthy as the rope. The kit and the language mirrored each other, and both preserved the same economy. Use only what is needed. Make room for listening. Let every piece serve 2 or 3 purposes whenever it can. All these modest things had their winter homes. Ropes dried in loose coils on pegs near the stove. Poles lay just inside the door where a hand could claim them while boots still caught at their laces. The bell slept in a bowl so it would not wake the baby. Knives rested on a high shelf with the edge turned toward the wall. People took care that no one tripped over winter in the dark. Morning had its choreography, boots upright to keep their legs from slumping. Mittens paired, scarf untwisted, pole claimed. Rope tested with a quiet pull, and then the door opened to the discipline of cold. When work was done and the river released its guest back onto boards and packed paths, the kit returned to its little stations looking uneventful. That was the point. Nothing in the small household of winter tools aspired to legend. The stories they entered were domestic, the bell's patient chime over the inside bend, the pole's soft correction near the old willow, the rope's generous length over the patch that sang at noon. the knife shaving wax off a candle to sweeten a sulking runner. In spring, these things looked foolish, bells asleep, poles idle, rope curled like a cat. But the river remembered them, and so did the hands. Next winter, when the pale road rode itself again across the water, the kit would be ready to speak the same quiet language the ice prefers. People rarely crossed alone. Winter asks that households move like households, with dogs nosing at rope coils, with hens bound for a neighbour's shed, with a cow borrowed for breeding, with sheep and goats searching for the long, patient crunch that means hay is near. The frozen river, which looked to a solitary walker like a pale hallway, turned into a slow, soft barn aisle when animals joined its length. The craft changed slightly then. It became less about the quicker side of a tapping pole and more about the wide conversation of breath, pace, and calm, about teaching hooves and paws that the river, for a little while each year, agreed to call itself a floor. The lesson began before the bank. Animals, even the sensible ones, were conservative scholars. A horse with good winter manners would step to the edge and sniff the snow the way it sniffs the hand of a new neighbour. Cattle lowered their heads and drew long, puzzled breaths, as if asking where the grass might be hiding under the white. Sheep, sociable and skittish, watched the dog's tail for grammar. People met this curiosity with quiet choreography. No one crowded the approach. No one made the first steps feel like a test. A handful of hay shaken lightly onto the first yards of ice drew confidence forward. A scatter of straw gave argument a texture it could accept. Voices stayed low and even. The rule was, invite, don't insist. Lines mattered as much with animals as with sleds. A herd was never shoved into a clump that would stomp in place. It was spilled gently into a long, narrow braid, like a ribbon laid across the white. Spacing turned panic into curiosity. Two people might take the flanks with poles held low, not as threats but as edges for attention, while a third walked ahead with a small bag of grain that rattled like modest promise. The dog worked mostly with posture, a little to the left to round, a little to the right to tuck, seldom barked. In winter, noise travels strangely. It can carve sharp corners inside an animal's chest. Better to let the bell on the lead rope speak the rhythm, one soft note at a time. Hooves learned the ice in different dialects. Horses wore temporary cleats when the day promised gloss. The sound of their steps, careful, spaced clicks, was winter's heartbeat. They preferred shallow angles over seams, the same way a person prefers a handrail when taking a narrow stair. Cattle moved with a heavier meter, broad hoof spreading weight in a way the river seemed to respect. Their tails told the truth. A tail held high with vanity meant the pace was foolish. A low, slow whisk meant the floor had been accepted. Sheep moved on trust more than physics. They placed their feet where another had just placed theirs, and if the first dozen found patience, the rest found it too. Goats, inveterate skeptics, tested with small hops, as if striking a match against the surface to see what kind of light it gave back. People prepared the path for hooves the way they prepared it for runners, but with different emphasis. Heeled seams received a more generous arch. Windrows on the inside bend were built a little higher so the flock's attention could lean against them. Where the river insisted on a slick, a mat of spruce boughs was laid wide, not as a bridge for weight but as a suggestion for balance. In cold, honest weather, animals hardly noticed these kindnesses. In moody, thaw-leaning hours, the kindnesses did most of the work. One learned to carry more straw than pride on larger moves, driving a small herd to stubble fields across the river or bringing a neighbour's heifer home. Rest was built into the road. Animals read fatigue earlier than people did. A horse's breath found too much steam. A cow's jaw paused in absent chewing. The dog's tongue travelled farther than its opinion deserved. Then the party stopped, not for speeches but for ordinary reasons, to adjust a rope, to retie a scarf, to sweep a patch of snow where glare confused eyes, to let the bell go silent for a minute. Rest on the ice was not a camp. It was a courtesy paid to hooves and to river at the same time. Hooves regained their grammar. The river, unbothered, continued its private conversation beneath. There were days when animals taught people the better line. A horse balked at a glossy plate that the pole had called acceptable. The driver did not grow proud of the pole. He grew grateful for the horse. He widened the arc, paid out the rope, and let the animal step where the animal believed the floor would hold. A pair of cows drew toward the bank where the winter current, remembered from summer, whispered under the white. Their reluctance wrote a new sentence in the map. Dogs, too, spoke truth with pauses, nose just above the surface, ears tilted to a seam, tail describing a modest circle that meant, "Here, please, not there." Winter is clever, but never cleverer than quiet animals doing their work. Children learn their part with animals as naturally as they learn their part with ropes. A child could hold the lead of a sheep with fingers inside a loop and their mittened other hand on the rope's flat. Another child might walk behind with a switch held low, a ribbon of suggestion rather than a stick of command. They learned not to walk at a horse's heels and not to run at a cow's nose. They learned that praise, good, then, was a tool like wax, passed over worry until worry began to slide more easily across the day. Night crossings with animals were rarer and gentler. The moon cast silver lanes on strong ice that even skittish creatures respected. Lantern posts at the approaches made pools of yellow that felt like stalls in an invisible stable. Bells mattered more then. Their voices seemed to make little rooms in the cold where attention could sit down. People kept the party small, 2, 3 animals at most, and chose the most honest part of the river for the errand. A midwife fetched by moonlight sometimes returned with a borrowed mare. A cow in distress might be led to the far barn where a neighbor's hands were steadier. Night accepted these errands if daytime rules were observed with twice the care. Not all animals were invited. Pigs, with their round hooves and argumentative minds, were often ferried in sled crates rather than asked to walk. Chickens rode in boxes with a cloth over the top. Their indignation was light and brief. Cats were not asked at all. They arrived where they wished and needed no ceremony. Dogs worked and then slept at the foot of the settling sled, their paws twitching through dreams of seams and willow markers, tails thumping at bells no one else could hear. The most delicate crossings were those that moved both animals and the human frailty that sometimes traveled with them, an elder with a stick, a mother with a child swaddled at her chest, a neighbor still thin from illness. Then the river had to be made into a room where everything fragile could be trusted. The line bent toward the bank, the rope was paid wider, the dog was called close, the pace softened into something like a lullaby. A horse that might pull in brisk where the now walked with its breath barely ahead of the bell. The ice, invited into the household for a quarter hour, accepted. Stories of animal crossings were quiet and practical. People remembered the winter when sheep learned to trust the inside bend because a boy had sprinkled a thread of oats from willow to willow. The season when an old mare refused the midstream plate and thereby saved a bold neighbor from a cold argument with physics. The afternoon when a single spruce bough, laid just so, convinced a cow that the world would hold for 5 more steps and then 5 more after that. No one made statues for such episodes. They were folded into the village's winter grammar, to be borrowed without attribution by the next day's work. At the far bank. The barn door thudded and hay whispered, and the river's peculiar school day ended. Hooves forgot the white floor and remembered wood and packed earth. People unbuckled the small cleats, shook straw from rope, poured a little warm mash for gratitude, and spoke the last low words to the animals. There. Then. Enough. The bell, which had been the sentence's punctuation, was laid in a bowl to sleep. The river slipped its pale hallway back into its own body and continued, unheard, toward spring. When a river decides to be a road, a village decides to be a market. It begins modestly, a few sleds bearing extra goods, a pair of lantern posts planted at the landing, a rumor that the mill town downstream will set tables on the broad reach this Saturday if the cold holds. Before long, the frozen reach gathers a neighborhood the way a kitchen gathers a family, without invitation, with the quiet certainty that there's room if everyone stands kindly. The marketing of winter is not like the shouting of summer stalls. It is closer to library talk, low voices over baskets, mitten hands weighing, bells at a respectful distance, a steady thread of privacy running through the entire public scene. The river, temporarily domesticated, hosts this politeness the way a long table hosts bread and soup. The layout is its own craft. Organizers, who are rarely anyone in particular and always everyone at once, read the ice as if planning a slow dance. Heavier carts and horse sleds keep to the outside arc where the pressure ridge is proud but known. Foot traffic braids closer to the inside bend where the ice is thickened by shallows. A central aisle, polished by a week of comings and goings, runs like a narrow boulevard with small, careful stalls set on either side. No one hammers stakes deep. Posts are footed in wooden shoes or tied into little tripods so that when the thaw arrives, the market can be lifted like a picnic. Lantern hooks bend over from their sticks like commas waiting for evening sentences. A windrow on the upriver approach is renewed each morning to catch the eyes of anyone arriving in a groundstorm. Stalls look temporary because they are, and because winter is suspicious of swagger. A table is nothing more than planks on trestles, their legs splayed wide for peace with the ice. A counter is a sled bed, brushed clean, its lashings tucked out of the way like a shirt's neat cuffs. Goods are chosen with winter scents. Cheese that keeps its good humor in cold. Cured fish wrapped in cloth and dusted with flour. Onions and cabbages in nets like patient bells. Candles with a generous waste so they burn without sulking. Mittens and socks knitted to a stubborn thickness. A jar of rendered fat that will go into 1,000 quiet meals. Iron nails in paper packets counted by a hand that has counted nails for 30 winters. A child's sled stands at one corner with neat bundles of willow switches tied in tens, because even markets respect the grammar of the river. The market soundscape is precise. Horse bells keep time at the periphery, never in the aisle. Boots whisper. The creak of leather reminds the listener that everything here was carried across the same pale floor. A polite tapping staff notes a seam now and then, not as a warning but as punctuation in speech. A knife's brief music comes when someone pairs a candle to fit a household's holder or shaves a breath of wax to sweeten a visiting runner. Traders' voices are warmer than the air but cooler than a summer fair's heat. Neighbors do not haggle theatrically when the ice sits listening. The currency of the day includes gossip, recipes, and messages riding home in someone else's pocket as much as it includes coins. Children learn a different curriculum here. They practice walking the narrow boulevard without fraying anyone's patience, hands folded around a cup of hot, weak tea so a slave can learn the angle that keeps warmth and avoids disaster. They are sent on errands that look simple and are therefore excellent. 2 candles from Mrs. Larkin's stall. 3 onions from the far end. A letter for the cooper's cousin over the bend. The path they take is a winter map stitched into errands, inside artery to the cheese. A shallow curve to avoid the heeled seam near the lantern pole. A respectful pause where horse sleds turn under the eye of a driver whose hands are busy. They come home with cheeks that feel like they have been ironed by the cold and with a new sentence learned. The ice is honest by the mill, but it's sulking at noon. Food appears in ways that respect the hour's temperament. A pot of thin stew sits on a wooden board near the lee of a stall, its warmth drifting into collars. Bread, cut with deliberate generosity, is traded for a coin or a favor owed or paid for in the currency of neighborly memory. You lent us a rope in January of the dry year. Take bread. The baker, who woke in the black hour, looks as pleased by the steam as anyone. A brazier exists only on still days and even then lives with humble caution. Fire is a summer genius. Winter prefers embers and a watchful hand. Children are taught to step wide, and dogs are discouraged with a murmured, "Not for you." There are rules written nowhere that everyone knows. Loads stay low in the market lane. High pride is for songs and long days, not for a morning when a jostled jar could make a slick the market would regret. Sleds are parked nose out, ropes coiled and hung so no loop lies like a snare at ankle height. Knives live sheathed except to cut bread or honesty from a knot. Bells can ring at the edge, and bells must sleep near the tables. A person with a loud story is gently given a chore that requires distance. Would you carry this note to the smith shed? So the vocal weather does not change. The river is part of the governance. If it speaks in those deep, travelling tones on bitter days, the market pauses, lets the sound pass through everyone's chest, and resumes as the plates settle. If a fresh, wet seam writes itself near the horse turn, someone sprinkles straw, someone else moves a table, and the aisle bends as if it had always preferred that curve. If ground fog rolls in and the far bank goes away, the lanterns are lit early, their wide mouths throwing yellow that stitches the stalls into a room. When the cold is indecisive and the surface feels like a sullen face, the market is brief and good-natured. Fewer tables, more talking while standing on wood at the landings, errands folded into the shortest hours. The market accepts being smaller rather than asking the ice to be braver. Trade has a winter arithmetic. Things that are light and precious travel far. Letters, needles, a rare spice wrapped in wax paper, the small gear and pin that will bring a clock back to its patient tick. Things that are heavy and honest travel in loops between neighbours. Sacks of grain sent in halves and wholes so that no one sleds a vanity. Bundles of alder billets passed along by 3 households in 1 hour so no single back owns the whole ache. Debts are written in a ledger someone keeps by the stove and also in a mental ledger everyone keeps under their cap. He took 2 pounds of nails against rye in March when the wind would not let us thresh. We'll bring it when the roads remember being roads. In this way, the market stitches winter's separate houses into a low, steady fabric. Stories travel as eagerly as goods. The midwife crossed by moon last night. The ice was crisp as linen. There's honest ice near the island. Look for the willow set at a tilt. The mill race is grumbling. Take the upstream detour after dinner. None of this feels like news. It feels like kneading. Hands that stretch and fold a community until it is ready for another week. A letter finds its stranger precisely because a neighbor knows another neighbor who knows a cousin. A missing glove finds its owner because a kid with teen noticed a mitten crying in the snow and propped it on the lantern pole like a small flag. In winter, lost things want to be found, and markets make finding a habit. Afternoons teach restraint. By 1 o'clock the aisle sheen looks wrong, too black, too proud, and the bells on the periphery ring thinner. Tables empty faster than they filled. Traders tie cloth over what remains, lift the light things first, then the heavier, and stack their trestles so spring will find them without complaint. No one squeezes the last coin from the day. Winter markets are most successful when they end a little early. The currency of safety is worth more than an hour's extra custom. The river, pleased by this thrift, often returns the favour. The glide home is smooth. The turning at the landing unremarkable. The stove's first breath a benediction on the walk back. The market becomes memory. A child rehearses a new not learned from watching a rope made obedient on a busy sled. An elder pockets a recipe for keeping onions from fretting in the cellar. A neighbour compares the tone of the chisel at the morning's test hole with the one heard near the aisle at noon and nods at the difference. The river keeps these small learnings alongside the larger ones about seams and bends. Together they add up to a season that feels less like survival and more like living conducted at winter speed. There are years when the fair grows bold. A travelling tinker sets up a little stage for mending pots. A fiddler lets a tune loose in the blue air, and the ice accepts the mood because the rules are still observed. Weight spread. Voices low. Animals steady. Exits unblocked. And there are thin years when the market is a handful of errand sleds exchanging nods in the pale hush. Both kinds count. What matters is that the river is treated as a borrowed floor and the village as a guest. The floor is paid for with attention. The guest returns the dishes clean. For all the attention that winter asks and all the manners that travellers offer, a frozen river still reserves the right to decline. It says no in many voices, a plate that sings too brightly at noon, a seam that opens like a lip and takes a breath, a black window that is honest in the morning and perfidious by afternoon. And sometimes, despite the listening and the measuring and the cautious lines, a foot goes in. This is not the end of a story, only the moment when a different grammar takes over, one written in short, ordinary sentences and practiced by everyone from the oldest hand to the youngest child. The art is not heroics. It is returning to shore with the least excitement possible and then putting the day back together. The first part of this grammar is private and immediate, how a single person behaves when their ankle, then their knee, then their waist meets water where a floor was promised. The body wants to argue with cold by threshing and by standing up. The river prefers the opposite. The quiet rule is, keep wide, stay long. A pole more than earns its keep here. Held crosswise, it becomes a small bridge of a person's own making, distributing weight along a span of ice that still believes in itself. The traveler leans the chest on the pole, elbows out, legs trailing behind as if swimming, and kicks not to rise but to slide. Boots that are still on, even wet, act like paddles. Boots wrenched off in panic become heavy, unhelpful objects that float away and leave feet unshod in a world of knives. The voice does its best work when it is not borrowed by shouting, pole crosswise, kicking, sliding. These are not cries. They are reminders, said aloud to keep the mind from inventing theatre. Rope is the second sentence, supplied by the party. Even in small groups, someone often carries a coil for nothing in particular, because winter likes coils. The person inland of the break kneels, pays out a loop, and slides it across the ice like a question. The one in the water does not wind it around the chest or the neck. The rope takes a wrist or a forearm or a shoulder with a simple bite. Pulling comes slow, never a hard yank that tears a new mouth in the surface. The pole keeps serving as the body's outrig, nose kept crosswise to the crack, kicks kept modest and regular. The line of effort forms a triangle, rescuer, rope, person, whose gentle geometry keeps the ice from being asked to do anything clever. There are tools that only appear on bad days and then live the rest of their lives on a peg. Awls with small wrist loops, two short spikes that can be driven into the surface and used like the hands of a clock to lever the chest forward, have a place in some households. So do short, blunt hooks made from old rake teeth lashed to a stick. They boast no beauty, but they bite into a stubborn rim and make pulling a matter of patience rather than leverage. A child trained in a quiet kitchen with a board on the floor will learn the wrist motion that makes awls useful without allowing them to turn into nails. Plant, pull, plant, pull, and knit stitch along the ice's edge. Children are better at this than they think. They are low to the ground, they accept the idea of scooting, and they like tools that make them feel important in small, lawful ways. Once a body is out, the river is not the only thing to consider. Water travels inside clothing and hides in cuffs and under collars, and wind makes a meal of any wet edge it can find. Winter households use blankets the way summer households use windows, always at hand, always opened and closed without comment. The person who is wet becomes a long, quiet parcel, coat eased off, blanket on, rope taken by someone else, sled recruited into ambulance duty without fanfare. The first destination is seldom the far shore. It is the nearest wood, plank, or sled bed, any surface that is not an opinionated sheet of ice. Tea becomes a medical instrument in winter, but it is served without ceremony, small sips, steam sent into the collar, hands delivered to warmth rather than dragged. The traveller's pride is the least useful thing at this hour. Neighbours ignore it gently. Communal rescue looks less like a scene than like household chores that have stepped outdoors. Someone sprinkles straw along the edge of the open seam so boots can believe in themselves. Someone else sets two short willow forks and lays a crosspole on them to keep the crack from being stepped into by help that's hurrying. A third person stands 10 paces back and says very little, watching the larger map, the swell of a pressure ridge that has begun to shift. The ambition of the wind trying to lift the exposed water into a slick farther along, the dog's tail changing punctuation. The witness does not fetch or carry. The witness keeps the rescue from becoming two accidents. This role rotates by intuition. Villagers know who is good at which silence. Animals have their own chapters in this grammar. A horse that has gone through a soft place becomes a diagram of trouble that requires space and low tone. Lines are paid out rather than pulled. The animal is allowed to make its own argument with the ice while a person's body is kept to one side, never directly behind where hooves may speak impulsively. Cows usually offer their weight to a rope with resignation. A pair of neighbours on a bank can make short work of the recovery if they squat low and pull with the rhythm of harvesting, not of alarm. Dogs need almost nothing and almost everything: a flat palm, a name spoken like a blanket, and the simple dignity of being lifted without scold. They shake, they look ashamed, they are told they're fools, and then they are perfect again. After the extraction comes the mending. A test hole is made near the bad place not to second-guess the past but to instruct the future. If the ice admits thinner numbers than the map had supposed, The route is redrawn on the spot. Switches are set farther inland, the rope paid longer for the next crossing, the story carried home with the same calm as sacks of flour. No one makes an anecdote of the trouble at the stove that night. Instead, 4 sentences are added to the village's grammar. The upstream bend has started a wet seam afternoon. The black plate opposite the island is haughty. Today. Wind from the south puts water under the healed cracks by the mill. We'll take the inside braid for a week. These are not thrilling. They are useful. Clothing and tools have their aftercare, too. Wet wool is not scalded. It is hung as tenderly as laundry in spring. Rope that tasted water is uncoiled and dried in loose circles, never tossed in a heap where it will learn bad habits. The pole laid crosswise over someone's chest returns to its peg with new authority. Its nicks are understood as vocabulary, not as damage. If awls were used, their little leather cords are checked, because a broken loop at the wrong hour is merely ironic, and winter does not appreciate irony. The child who planted those awls on the kitchen board last month is thanked with a piece of bread and a smear of jam. Not as a reward, but as wages for having joined the season's workforce. Some households rehearse rescue as they rehearse prayers, once in early winter, when the first honest ice arrives. Once in late winter, when the river begins forgetting its promises in the afternoons. Practice happens on solid ground with poor props, a rug for the river, a broomstick for a pole, a coil of washing line for the rope, and the mood is cheerful. If I say pole crosswise, what do you do? Plant, pull, plant, pull. Laughter is allowed because it spends the fear in advance. The body, properly bribed with repetition, remembers the choreography when the cold tries to steal it. There are limits that rescue does not insult. No one sends 3 people to the lip of a wide new lead because that is how 4 people are required for the story. The river is granted the dignity of being larger than a person's will. Sleds unload until they are nearly imaginary. A route is abandoned for a week without leaving an apology. Errands are rewritten around the admission that winter is the author even when people are holding the pen. This is not submission. It is collaboration with a season that has earned co-authorship by sheer endurance. When the fallen are warmed and the rope is dry and the story has been edited into its 4 quiet new sentences, the village returns to its chores. There is fodder to move, a hinge to tighten, onions to check for sulking in the cellar. The river is not sulked at. It receives, without ceremony, a little respect that was already owed. The line bends closer to the bank tomorrow. The crossing happens earlier while the day is tight. A child who did not fall is fitted with the awls and told to show the motion again. Because knowledge is a loaf that must be baked often or it goes stale years later. When children who once practiced on rugs are the ones setting switches and paying out rope. The stories of falls have been polished flat by telling. Remember the winter when Lena went into the waist and came out with that bell still ringing on her rope. Remember when the horse put a hoof through and took it back as if it had stepped on a rude remark. They are told with fondness because they end in kitchens. The river does not mind this affection. It understands that humans make friendships with anything that can be coaxed into a room and then persuaded to let them go home again. A river may agree to be a road, but it keeps certain places for itself. Springs that seep from hidden sandbeds, mill races that return water with a different sentiment than the rivers, tributary mouths that arrive arguing. All of these make local climates under the ice. From a high bank, the sheet can look uniform as porcelain. At boot level, it is a patchwork of loyalties. The craft of winter crossing therefore includes a geography of exceptions, a mental map of warm places in a cold season, of restless places in an hour that otherwise feels still. Springs are the quietest of these exceptions. They announce themselves like shy neighbors, not with noise but with subtle absence. Hoarfrost grows exuberant across a broad, honest reach and then, suddenly, thins to a polite film. Snow that sits happily elsewhere slumps a shade lower here, as if the table under the cloth were breathing. Willow roots nearby are heavy with rime, but a small circle under one overhang looks damp when it has no right to be. Elders teach children to read these subtractions. Where winter seems a little less winter, be kinder with your feet, they say. The pole confirms the suspicion, not with alarm, but with a just-so conversation. One tap, a second tap 3 paces downwind, a third place toward the inside bend. The line bends accordingly, exaggerated like a bow to someone older than you. Mill races are franker. Where a low dam gathers water for work and then returns it, the river gains an opinionated pulse. In deep cold, the returned water behaves. Its warmth vanishes a few lengths downstream, and the ice, if it forms at all, thickens like layered glass. But in swing weather, after a wind from the south, after a sulky thaw that didn't quite commit, the outflow writes a new sentence into the reach. It lays a dark tongue across the underside of the sheet and licks at seams, especially where earlier cracks provided grammar. You can hear it with your boots before you see it, a faint, hollow, dish-shaped sound that your body translates into a slower step and a longer rope. Villagers treat mill bends like cousins who are welcome but not left alone with the good plates. A willow switch planted on the safe bank is trimmed shorter than usual, an agreed symbol, and is replaced more often. Because the mood of the water changes with the miller's day, tributary mouths are chattier still. Wherever a smaller stream joins, the river's undervoice gains grit, bubbles, debris that pretends to be harmless but sharpens the under-ice conversation. None of this is dramatic. The ice above may still be several mitten lengths thick, but current plays its old game with edges, and the top layer, the bubbled, milky quilt that sealers and sleds appreciate, grows tired there sooner than it does elsewhere. On such mouths, experience suggests a double courtesy. Give the confluence a generous berth and arrive earlier in the day if you must cross near it at all. Early light lends the surface firmness. Afternoon sun steals patience from joints and hems. Practice around these places looks simple from a distance and very precise up close. Spruce boughs, green and smelling of sap in the cold, ride along on sleds. Their needles bite into slick gloss where springs have polished a small oval. Laid gently in 2 or 3 courses, the boughs invent a floor just long enough to cross without asking the ice to pretend. The boughs are not magic. They are humility in botanical form. When the crossing is done, the bough quilt is pulled back to the bank, never left to freeze into the river's mouth and ask future feet to trust a stale kindness. Straw lives the same double life, bridge and broom. A sprinkle over a wet seam gives a boot purchase and marks the line for the return. A larger shake near a resentful mill outflow makes a gap look like a pale stitch the eye can read in fog. Households keep a straw bag tied close so it does not blow its usefulness across the reach before the hand that needs it arrives. Afterward, straw is gathered again, because winter respects tidiness. And a season is long enough to make a mess if you let it. Detours are the other tool, less romantic than bows, more important than any bravado. A path that normally braids near the middle will, on a warming week, cleave to the inside bend and perhaps run the bank for 100 steps before returning to the usual arc. The result is a slower letter written to the far shore, but a clearer one. Villagers do this without announcements. One morning, a traveller will notice that the shallow runner polish has wandered quite close to the sedge. The next morning, the willow switches will agree. On the third, the old path will look abandoned, not because anyone scolded it, but because everyone stopped needing it. River maps are seasonal, yes, but within the season they are weekly novellas. Rules for children grow stricter near exceptions, and they are framed as courtesy so they stick. We don't step ahead of the pole where the spring keeps its secret. We keep a mitten on the rope by the mill's mouth. We pass the tributary the way we pass a sleeping dog, by giving it space and not being interesting. These are not warnings in the voice that makes boys proud and girls ashamed. They are manners, and children like manners when they feel like membership instead of tests. Animals have their own chapters here. A horse reads springs with its belly, not its eyes. You will feel a breath stiffen beneath the saddle blanket before a hoof complains. The driver honors the horse's doubt, arcs wider, and later, back by the stove. Tells the story in plainer numbers so memory is not left to mood. 2 poles more toward the bank by the willow that leans. Cattle dislike mill mouths in a way that is easy to sympathize with. They inherit their fear from the sound. People plan to cross above the outflow or below it by 80 steps. They do not march a cow through a musical instrument. Dogs, ever method, skirt springs without fuss, tails in low commas. It is one of the few places where a person trusts a dog's choice before the poles, sound and color join to give counsel. At springs, the test hole's water rises with appetite, even when surrounding ice is thick. The rim refuses a crisp ring when the chisel taps it. The note is felt more than heard. Color there is fancy, too, and cannot be relied on. Black can be strong where wind has kept snow away and cold has built from below. White can be treacherous where slush froze into a soft top. Travelers learn to treat prettiness as if it were perfume. Pleasant, not decisive. Only the thickness matters, and even that is read in the context of the river's memory. How fast it ran last week. How insistent the south wind has been. In hamlets that keep a written ledger for winter, these exceptions earn lines in the margin. A child tracing a finger down the year's ice. Notes can read that the spring under the alder opened in January of the short. Hay, or that the mill race wore a wet mouth every afternoon in the year of the geese. The ledger is not a law. It's an elder that does not mind repetition. It turns one person's caution into a village's clarity. When, in some future winter, a new neighbor brings confidence from a different river, the ledger will introduce them to the local hesitations with a politeness no lecture could match. It is tempting, on bright days with a hard sky, to forget these places. The pole pings crisp, the rope ride short, the sled hums like a happy throat, and errands multiply the way bread multiplies at table. This is when springs and mouths do most of their quiet work. A party that has grown brisk, making straight lines because they are available, comes upon the friendly lie of consistent surface. The cure is not scolding. It is a ritual pause. Someone kneels and gathers a gloveful of snow to sweep the face of the ice here and there. Someone taps not for show but for conversation. Someone counts to 15 and calls it listening. The line bends with new courtesy, and the river, having felt seen, allows the day to proceed. Mill owners and ferrymen become winter partners in managing exceptions. A miller who can afford to slack a gate during a half hour when the school children cross is remembered kindly all season. A ferryman who hangs a rag at the tributary mouth when he has broken ice for his boat's narrow channel is not remembered at all, and that is the praise he wants. The river is a commons made of private acts. Near exceptions, the best of those acts are nearly invisible. Spring proper, seasonal spring, the one that sits in air rather than under sand, turns these problem places into chorus leaders. Candling begins near them first. The white layer's bubbles lengthen into vertical panes that hold their shape long enough to inspire confidence, and then betray it with elegant indifference. Villagers rehearse stopping before they have to stop. Loads lighten. Bells rest. The detour becomes the route. The route becomes memory. People call it prudence, not loss. In the garden, onion starts are pressed into cold earth with fingers still sore from rope. In the barn, runners are scraped and hung, their wax pared and saved for august boots. The river is thanked with a day of abstaining. Stories about these places look like footnotes when written down and feel like rescues when remembered. We widened for the spring under the alder that year. The fox kept visiting the henhouse. We learned to prefer the lower crossing when the miller's second son took up courting and forgot the gate. We found that the mouth by the poplars sulked at noon. So we went at dawn and had tea on the far bank while the world was still quiet. These are not grand, but they are the furniture of a winter household. They make a room livable, not impressive. A frozen river offers two shores, but in winter it quietly provides a third, the places in between. Midstream islands, gravel bars sleeping under a quilt of snow, alder hummocks, and low willow tongues become way stations, little parentheses in the sentence of a crossing. They are not destinations. They are commas, chances to breathe, to look, to retie, to think. In summers, the current protects them with a small moat of sound and effort. In winters, the ice lays a polite hallway to their edges and asks, in its reserved manner, "Do you need a moment?" Travelers who accept that invitation make better crossings and longer winters. The character of an island in frost is different than in green. In warm months, it is a place of buzzing and soft mud, of reeds that argue with your shins, of dragonflies that draw quick blue signatures over the shallows. In winter, it becomes a cabinet. The willow wands stiffen into promise. Driftwood, encased in rime, looks like a set of clean tools laid out for use. The low crown of a gravel bar, wind-combed and honest, turns into a table where decisions can be made without asking the ice to carry the weight of a conversation. Villagers know which midstream pieces accept guests, which ones sulk under snow, and which are better admired from the safe curl of the inside bend. Approach has its manners. An island is greeted at its upstream shoulder, where the river's old energy is gentlest under the winter lid. The line arcs with a deliberate grace so that feet and runners arrive at an angle that allows stopping without a theatrical flourish. No one charges the landing as if finishing a race. No one asks a horse to plant all four hooves and argue with momentum on the last two steps. Instead, ropes are paid out a breath longer. Voices find the lower shelf they prefer in cold. And the little bell that marks the rhythm of the day performs its task without calling attention to itself. On the island itself. The first rule is to remember that it is not a dock but a guest room. Sleds are drawn up onto ground, or at least onto wind-packed snow that sits over ground, so that their weight leaves the river free to think its own thoughts for a minute. Ropes are coiled loosely on sled rails or hung on a willow fork where a mitten can find them again without hunting. Poles are laid where they won't slide away and pretend to be reeds. Children are given small, dignified chores. Shake snow from the willow wands set aside last week. Count the switches in the bundle and make sure we still have 10. Sweep the landing with a mitten so the next traveller will see the subtle difference between honest crust and gloss that talks too quickly. Way stations have supplies the way a good cupboard has staples. In the lee of a willow clump there might be a conservative cache, a thin sheaf of spruce boughs tied with twine. A straw sack that has survived 3 snows because each visitor retied its throat against the wind. A pair of short willow forks for making a crossbar over a sudden seam if the river has written a new sentence overnight. No one hoards these things. No one treats them as a personal accomplishment. They exist by the same logic as a kettle in a neighbour's kitchen, shared precisely because they ought to be in reach when needed. When a cache is used, it is replaced soon or explained soon, and the explanation travels faster than a letter. The island teaches calm adjustments rather than bold inventions. A traveller might kneel and test a fresh suspicion with the chisel's modest ring. Once, then again nearer the downstream shoulder, then a third time where last week's runner-polished curve toward the far bank. A dog might be encouraged to drink snow there, not because thirst matters so much as because the dog's minute standing still helps the party's attention gather itself. A horse's breast strap is touched and retied lower by 2 holes, not because it had failed, but because the next reach will climb a little toward the inside bend and the pull wants a different angle. These are the hands-width edits that keep a day from being rewritten by accident. Wind matters on islands as much as ice does. A bare hummock offers no argument to a north wind. A willow crown turns a savage gust into a draft one can dress against. Travellers set small windbreaks the way seamstresses pin fabric, sparingly, skillfully, only as much as holds the shape for a few unreactive minutes. A triangle of reed mats lashed to 3 willows becomes a room for a cup of tea. 2 sleds nosed together with a blanket between them make a softness that fools the face into forgetting the air's edge. Fires are for sure. On midstream earth, the closest thing to a hearth is breath over a tin mug, steam lingering briefly in the reed shadow before being recruited by the sky. Naming helps memory, and memory keeps people safe. Islands collect domestic names that sound just right at a kitchen table. The teacup, the long plate, willow cap, the dog's curve. These are not picturesque indulgences. They are coordinates. We'll take tea at the teacup means a pause on the upstream cup of ground where the wind behaves and the far braid is legible. Go around the long plate means stick to the left where the ice lacks old grudge lines and do not be lured by the tempting middle that enjoys making a liar of confidence at noon. Children learn the names as they learn which drawer keeps the spoons and which peg takes the rope with the good memory. Islands also serve the winter post. Letters that are shy of pockets, wrapped in wax paper and scolded for wrinkling, are handed to the next traveller with a glance toward the willow fork that has become the temporary post office. If you stop at Willow Cap, leave this for Marta's sled if she comes behind you, someone says, and the habit is so old that it no longer requires asking whether a sled will, in fact, stop. The fork holds a rag for the eye, a parcel for the hand, a promise that a line stretches across the white even when bustle thins. Market days make this choreography look like commerce. Island days reveal it as neighborliness spread onto a pale table. Midstream pauses are also classrooms of manner for animals. Cattle learn that the snow here tastes of willow and patience, not of alarm. Sheep, whose attention arrives in parcels as small as their hooves, settle into the lee and forget to worry for a blessed quarter hour. Horses learn to accept being UN-cleated for the return when the day has warmed. Dogs invent their own curriculum, circling twice, setting their paws where travelers will not be bothered by the plastering of dog enthusiasm. Finally lying with their chins on their paws and eyes narrowed into the kind of happiness that is produced by responsibility successfully carried. Etiquette on way stations is a ledger of tiny debts paid immediately. You lift the straw sack to check that weather has not eaten it and set it down with its throat lashed tighter than you found it. You pick the old twigs from last week's boughs and add 3 new ones from your sled if fortune spared you a brushy bank on the way. You resist the urge to leave a large sign about how sensible you have been. Instead, you leave one switch at a tilt where the arc resumes, a mark that informs without cluttering. You carry away what the wind would otherwise carry into spring: paper, twine ends, a foolishly shed glove that would become a lie told by summer's eddies. Triage is a way station's honest work. On a warming day, an island bears news that the river mutters everywhere else. The chisel's tone fattens. The test hole's water comes up like a breath. The bubbled top layer admits a little slush when a mitten presses. You decide here to lighten the load, to space more generously across the next reach, to pay the rope longer. Sometimes you decide to turn back, while turning back is a choice rather than an apology. The island makes this dignity possible. Courage that refuses to use islands wears out. Prudence that uses them lasts all season. Night remakes the islands as beadwork in a necklace of small lights. Lanterns at the banks throw 2 warm rooms onto the water. The moon, if it is winter's friend that week, lays a thin silver lid along the midstream shapes so that the teacup and the long plate are legible in a single glance. Travelers pause more briefly then, partly because cold is a better cook at night and partly because dark asks for a quicker humility. Bells lower their voices. Rope is kept shorter. A letter changes hands with a nod. Way stations are still commas, but the sentence moves faster between them to BY spring. Islands are the first to remember another language. The willow buds swear they can taste April. The driftwood smells like last year's benches. The gravel shows a wet grin in the noon sun. Crossings honor this memory. Loads thin. The pauses stop looking like work and start looking like farewell. A last bundle of boughs is carried back to shore, because the river has no more use for that sort of kindness and spring prefers another kind. The names, teacup, long plate, are stored with the sleds. They will be needed again when the river lends its floor next year. And the first truly cold dawn makes the island crowns look like knots tied in silver threads across a pale scarf. When people speak of winter's endurance, they often praise mornings and tools and a certain piety about counting. They seldom praise the pause. That omission is undeserved. The middle of a crossing is a place, not a portion of time, and islands turn time into place without drama. A traveller who knows where to pause knows where to continue. A village that shares the art of stopping on purpose arrives at spring with fewer stories about luck and more about habit. Between 2 shores, the winter household finds a 3rd room, and in that room it does what households do best. It tidies, it shares, it changes its mind, and then it goes on.